Chapter 11. A Visit from the Ukraina. Early in May, two young men from the Ukraina arrived in Petrograd. Both had lived in America for a number of years and had been active in the Yiddish labor and anarchist movements. One of them had also been the editor of an English weekly anarchist paper, The Alarm, published in Chicago. In 1917, at the outbreak of the revolution, they left for Russia together with the other emigrants. Arriving in their native country, they joined the anarchist activities there, which had gained tremendous impetus through the revolution. Their main field was the Ukraina. In 1918, they aided in the organization of the anarchist federation Nabat, Alarm, and began the publication of a paper by that name. Theoretically, they were at variance with the Bolsheviki. Practically, the Federation anarchists, even as the anarchists throughout Russia, worked with the Bolsheviki and fought on every front against the counter-revolutionary forces. When the two Ukrainian comrades learned of our arrival in Russia, they repeatedly tried to reach us, but owing to the political conditions and the practical impossibility of travelling, they could not come north. Subsequently, they had been arrested and imprisoned by the Bolsheviki. Immediately upon their release, they started for Petrograd, travelling illegally. They knew the dangers confronting them: arrest and possible shooting for the possession and use of false documents, but they were willing to risk anything, because they were determined that we should learn the facts about the Povstanci, revolutionary peasants' movements, led by the extraordinary figure Nestor Makhno. They wanted to acquaint us with the history of the anarchist activities in Russia and relate how the iron hand of the Bolsheviki had crushed them. During 2 weeks, in the stillness of the Petrograd nights, the two Ukrainian anarchists unrolled before us the panorama of the struggle in the Ukraina. Dispassionately, quietly, and with almost uncanny detachment, the young men told their story. 13 different governments had ruled Ukraina. Each of them had robbed and murdered the peasantry, made ghastly pogroms, and left death and ruin in its way. The Ukrainian peasants, a more independent and spirited race than their northern brothers, had come to hate all governments and every measure which threatened their land and freedom. They banded together and fought back their oppressors, all through the long years of the revolutionary period. The peasants had no theories. They could not be classed in any political party. Theirs was an instinctive hatred of tyranny, and practically the whole of Ukraina soon became a rebel camp. Into the seething cauldron there came, in 1917, Nestor Makhno. Makhno was a Ukrainian-born, a natural rebel. He became interested in anarchism at an early age. At 17, he attempted the life of a Tsarist spy and was sentenced to death. But owing to his extreme youth, the sentence was commuted to Katorga for life imprisonment, 1/3 of the term in chains. The February Revolution opened the prison doors for all political prisoners, Makhno among them. He had then spent 10 years in the Butarki prison in Moscow. He had built a limited schooling when first arrested, but in prison he used his leisure to good advantage. By the time of his release, he had acquired considerable knowledge of history, political economy and literature. Shortly after his liberation, Makhno returned to his native village, where he organized a trade union and a local Soviet. Then he threw himself in the revolutionary movement, and during all of 1917, he was the spiritual teacher and leader of the rebel peasants who had risen against the landed proprietors. In 1918, when the Brest Peace opened Ukraina to German and Austrian occupation, Makhno organized the rebel peasant bands in defense against the foreign armies. He fought against Skoropadsky, the Ukrainian hetman, who was supported by German bayonets. He waged successful guerrilla warfare against Petlura, Kalydin, Grigoriev, and Denikin. A conscious anarchist, he laboured to give the instinctive rebellion of the peasantry definite aim and purpose. It was the Makhno ideal that the social revolution was to be defended against all enemies, against every counter-revolutionary or reactionary attempt from the right and left. At the same time, educational and cultural work was carried on among the peasants to develop them along anarchist communist lines with the aim of establishing free peasant communes. In February 1919, Makhno entered into an agreement with the Red Army. He was to continue to hold the southern front against Denikin and to receive from the Bolsheviki the necessary arms and ammunition. Makhno was to remain in charge of the Povstanci, now grown into an army, the latter to have autonomy in its local organizations, the revolutionary Soviets of the district, which covered several provinces. It was agreed that the Povstanci should have the right to hold conferences, freely discuss their affairs, and take action upon them. 3 such conferences were held in February, March and April, but the Bolsheviki failed to live up to their agreement. The supplies which had been promised Makhno, and which he needed desperately, would arrive after long delays or fail to come altogether. It was charged that this situation was due to the orders of Trotsky, who did not look favourably upon the independent rebel army. However it be, Makhno was hampered at every step, while Denikin was gaining ground constantly. Presently, the Bolsheviki began to object to the Free Peasant Soviets, and in May 1919, the commander-in-chief of the southern armies, Kamenev, accompanied by members of the Krakow government, arrived at the Makhno headquarters to settle disputed matters. In the end, the Bolshevik military representatives demanded that the Povstanci dissolve. The latter refused, charging the Bolsheviki with a breach of their revolutionary agreement. Meanwhile, the Denikin advance was becoming more threatening, and Makhno still received no support from the Bolsheviki. The peasant army then decided to call a special session of the Soviet for June 15th. Definite plans and methods were to be decided upon to check the growing menace of Denikin, but on June 4th, Trotsky issued an order prohibiting the holding of the conference and declaring Makhno an outlaw. In a public meeting in Krakow, Trotsky announced that it were better to permit the whites to remain in Ukraina than to suffer Makhno. The presence of the whites, he said, would influence the Ukrainian peasantry in favour of the Soviet government, whereas Makhno and his Povstanci would never make peace with the Bolsheviki. They would attempt to possess themselves of some territory and to practice their ideas, which would be a constant menace to the communist government. It was practically a declaration of war against Makhno and his army. Soon, the latter found itself attacked on 2 sides at once, by the Bolsheviki and by Denikin. The Povstanci were poorly equipped and lacked the most necessary supplies for warfare, yet the peasant army for a considerable time succeeded in holding its own by the sheer military genius of its leader and the reckless courage of his devoted rebels. At the same time, the Bolsheviki began a campaign of denunciation against Makhno and his Povstanci. The communist press accused him of having treacherously opened the southern front to Denikin and branded Makhno's army a bandit gang and its leader a counter-revolutionist who must be destroyed at all costs. But this counter-revolutionist fully realised the Denikin menace to the revolution. He gathered new forces and support among the peasants, and in the months of September and October 1919, his campaign against Denikin gave the latter its death blow on the Ukraina. Makhno captured Denikin's artillery base at Mariupol, annihilated the rear of the enemy's army, and succeeded in separating the main body from its base of supply. This brilliant manoeuvre of Makhno and the heroic fighting of the rebel army again brought about friendly contact with the Bolsheviki. The ban was lifted from the Povstanci, and the communist press now began to eulogize Makhno as a great military genius and brave defender of the revolution in Ukraina. But the differences between Makhno and the Bolsheviki were deep-rooted. He strove to establish free peasant communes in Ukraina, while the communists were bent on imposing the Moscow rule. Ultimately, a clash was inevitable, and it came early in January 1920. At that period, a new enemy was threatening the revolution. Grigoriev, formerly of the Tsarist army, later friend of the Bolsheviki, now turned against them. Having gained considerable support in the south because of his slogans of freedom and free Soviets, Grigoriev proposed to Makhno that they join forces against the communist regime. Makhno called a meeting of the 2 armies and there publicly accused Grigoriev of counter-revolution and produced evidence of numerous pogroms organized by him against the Jews. Declaring Grigoriev an enemy of the people and of the revolution, Makhno and his staff condemned him and his aides to death, executing them on the spot. Part of Grigoriev's army joined Makhno. Meanwhile, Denikin kept pressing Makhno, finally forcing him to withdraw from his position. Not of course without bitter fighting all along the line of 900 versts, the retreat lasting 4 months, Makhno marching towards Galicia. Denikin advanced upon Krakow, and then further north, capturing Orel and Kursk, and finally reached the gates of Tula, in the immediate neighbourhood of Moscow. The Red Army seemed powerless to check the advance of Denikin, but meanwhile, Makhno had gathered new forces and attacked Denikin in the rear. The unexpectedness of this new turn and the extraordinary military exploits of Makhno's men in this campaign disorganized the plans of Denikin, demoralized his army, and gave the Red Army the opportunity of taking the offense against the counter-revolutionary enemy in the neighbourhood of Tula. When the Red Army reached Alexandrovsk, after having finally beaten the Denikin forces, Trotsky again demanded of Makhno that he disarm his men and place himself under the discipline of the Red Army. The Povstansky refused, whereupon an organized military campaign against the rebels was inaugurated, the Bolsheviki taking many prisoners and killing scores of others. Makhno, who managed to escape the Bolshevik net, was again declared an outlaw and a bandit. Since then, Makhno had been uninterruptedly waging guerrilla warfare against the Bolshevik regime. The story of the Ukrainian friends, which I have related here in very condensed form, sounded as romantic as the exploits of Stenka Razin, the famous Cossack rebel immortalized by Gogol. Romantic and picturesque, but what bearing did the activities of Makhno and his men have upon anarchism? I questioned the two comrades. Makhno, my informants explained, was himself an anarchist, seeking to free Ukraina from all oppression and striving to develop and organize the peasants' latent anarchistic tendencies. To this end, Makhno had repeatedly called upon the anarchists of the Ukraina and of Russia to aid him. He offered them the widest opportunity of propagandistic and educational work, supplied them with printing outfits and meeting places, and gave them the fullest liberty of action. Whenever Makhno captured a city, freedom of speech and press for anarchists and left social revolutionists was established. Makhno often said, "I am a military man, and I have no time for educational work. But you who are writers and speakers, you can do that work. Join me, and together we shall be able to prepare the field for a real anarchist experiment." But the chief value of the Makhno movement lay in the peasants themselves, my comrades thought. It was a spontaneous, elemental movement, the peasants' opposition to all governments being the result not of theories, but of bitter experience and of instinctive love of liberty. They were fertile ground for anarchist ideas. For this reason, a number of anarchists joined Makhno. They were with him in most of his military campaigns and energetically carried on anarchist propaganda during that time. I have been told by Zorin and other communists that Makhno was a Jew-baiter and that his povstanci were responsible for numerous brutal pogroms. My visitors emphatically denied the charges. Makhno bitterly fought pogroms, they stated. He had often issued proclamations against such outrages, and he even with his own hand punished some of those guilty of assault on Jews. Hatred of the Hebrew was of course common in the Ukraina. It was not eradicated, even among the Red soldiers. They too have assaulted, robbed, and outraged Jews. Yet no one holds the Bolsheviki responsible for such isolated instances. The Ukraina is infested with armed bands who are often mistaken for Makhnovtsi and who have made pogroms. The Bolsheviki are aware of this, have exploited the confusion to discredit Makhno and his followers. However, the anarchists of the Ukraina, I was informed, did not idolize the Makhno movement. They knew that the povstanci were not conscious anarchists. Their paper, Nabat, had repeatedly emphasized this fact. On the other hand, the anarchists could not overlook the importance of popular movement, which was instinctively rebellious, anarchistically inclined, and successful in driving back the enemies of the revolution, which the better organized and equipped Bolshevik army could not accomplish. For this reason, many anarchists considered it their duty to work with Makhno, but the bulk remained away. They had their larger cultural, educational, and organizing work to do. The invading counter-revolutionary forces, though differing in character and purpose, all agreed in their relentless persecution of the anarchists. The latter were made to suffer whatever the new regime. The Bolsheviki were no better in this regard than Denikin or any other white element. Anarchists filled Bolshevik prisons. Many had been shot, and all legal anarchist activities were suppressed. The Cheka especially was doing ghastly work, having resurrected the old Tsarist methods, including even torture. My young visitors spoke from experience. They had repeatedly been in Bolshevik prisons themselves.